Art mirrors the human condition.
We uncover its hidden patterns,
Experience human creativity.
elevated by digital analysis.
Welcome to the Academy.
Join the journey.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing a truly fascinating intellectual story, the profound evolution of human guilt. We're going to track this incredible literary and philosophical journey, starting from traditional religious sin, moving into institutional paranoia, and finally landing on pure existential absurdity. The source material we're unpacking today looks at three monumental novels, not just as isolated classics, but as three distinct, mind-bending stages in the total destruction of our traditional moral universe. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with Part 1, the modern existential crisis. Then we'll explore 2, Dostoevsky, the burden of conscience, 3, Kafka, guilt without a crime, and 4, Camus, the absurd hero. We'll wrap it all up by comparing the three worlds and then drawing a psychological map of modernity.
To begin our exploration, we really have to establish the central crisis of the modern era. Section 1, the modern existential crisis, the death of meaning.
And that brings us to the absolute ultimate question at the heart of our source material. You see, for centuries, humanity relied on a stable external authority, specifically God, to basically tell us who we were. But when that unquestionable authority gets destroyed, how in the world are we supposed to live? How do we even function when we can't rely on external rules to define our reality anymore?
This evolutionary arc elegantly illustrates exactly how this played out. We start out in a world where God establishes moral authority. But then, as we hit the late 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche drops a bombshell with the concept of the death of God. He acts as this ultimate philosophical pressure point, asking a truly terrifying question: if God is dead, who actually creates our values? And this catalyst leads us directly into our first distinct psychological response: mankind's desperate attempt to somehow fill that massive void.
Which brings us to 19th century Russia. Section 2, Dostoevsky, the burden of conscience. Man tries to replace God.
In Dostoevsky's absolute masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, we meet a man who actively attempts to fill that void left by God with his own personal moral theory. The protagonist, Raskolnikov, is intensely, almost dangerously ambitious. As the source text points out, he doesn't commit murder because he's just greedy for money. No, his crime is a twisted philosophical experiment. He literally believes humanity is divided into ordinary and extraordinary people, and he desperately wants to know if he's one of the extraordinary ones. Can an exceptional individual transcend ordinary morality and kill for a higher purpose without feeling any remorse whatsoever? He's essentially asking, can I actually become the person I believe I am? It's a fundamental test of his very identity.
Now, the classical logic of morality usually goes like this. First, you have the crime, which is followed by the psychological guilt, which then eventually leads to the judgment, right? Well, Raskolnikov's grand Nietzschean experiment totally backfires. Why? Because his grand intellectual theory simply cannot overpower his actual psychological reality. He tries so hard to tell himself he's beyond ordinary morality, like a modern Napoleon. But his own conscience utterly refuses to cooperate. Amidst the claustrophobic, dirty, feverish streets of St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky gives us this profound insight. A philosophical idea just cannot liberate a human being from their own deep-seated moral structures.
But what happens if that sequence of guilt is completely disrupted? Let's move to Section 3, Kafka, Guilt Without a Crime, the Incomprehensible Institution.
Here, Kafka triggers a massive, mind-bending psychological inversion. Think about this new sequence. The judgment actually happens first. In his novel The Trial, the protagonist Joseph K. is arrested without ever knowing his crime. So the judgment happens, and then comes this agonizing uncertainty, which breeds a profound sense of possible guilt. The accusation itself literally creates the psychological reality. Joseph K. starts off assuming, hey, there must be some sort of clerical mistake, but eventually he just gets completely sucked into the dizzying, maddening logic of the court.
Kafka completely removes that classical comfort of eventual truth. In a traditional tragedy like Oedipus, the protagonist breaks a law unknowingly, but eventually the truth finally comes out. But in Kafka's world, there is no final revelation. The mystery just remains mystery. And this creates a truly terrifying modern condition: ontological guilt. It's this deep, inescapable feeling of guilt that is just baked into your very existence, without any identifiable sin. You are somehow responsible before you even understand what you are responsible for.
In this universe, ultimate authority shifts entirely away from God and lands squarely on the shoulders of the bureaucracy.
And this institution is terrifying because it behaves almost exactly like an invisible god. It wields omnipresent authority, it hoards inaccessible knowledge, and it holds literal power over life and death. But unlike God, Kafka's institution completely lacks a coherent moral universe. It never explains itself. It's just pure authority, completely stripped of meaning. And honestly, as the source text notes, that right there might just be the essential Kafkaesque nightmare.
Finally, we step out of the dark maze of Prague and right into the bright Mediterranean sun. Section 4. Camus, the absurd hero. The universe is indifferent.
Placing these two protagonists side by side really highlights this massive philosophical shift of the 20th century. Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov suffers because he over-intellectualizes existence. He desperately wants to be a god. He thinks way too much and he constructs these massive theories. But Camus' protagonist, Meursault, he suffers for the exact opposite reason. He absolutely refuses to pretend that humanity has some higher meaning. He doesn't build theories at all. He just experiences the world purely physically. You know, the heat, the blinding sunlight, the sea, the feeling of fatigue. Meursault simply experiences existence.
Now, Meursault does commit a real crime. He actually murders a man. But the deeper, far more disturbing revelation of Camus' novel is that the courtroom is actually less interested in the murder itself and far more interested in punishing him for his emotional nonconformity. Because at his own mother's funeral, Meursault doesn't cry. He completely refuses to manufacture emotions just because society expects them. He essentially tells the entire world, I am simply what I am. And society finds that raw honesty unbelievably dangerous. Ultimately, he's condemned for refusing to play along with society's shared illusions.
So, let's consolidate this sweeping intellectual story we've been tracing. Section 5. Comparing the three worlds. A metaphysical breakdown. Synthesizing our whole journey, we can see exactly what the modern individual is trapped by in each of these eras. In Dostoevsky's world, the ultimate authority is God and the individual's own conscience, and it's reflected in this claustrophobic, deeply psychological city of St. Petersburg, where the body is intensely connected to spiritual suffering. Then with Kafka, the authority morphs into the meaningless institution, set in a massive bureaucratic labyrinth, where the human body is basically just vulnerable flesh waiting to be arrested and examined. And finally, in Camus, the authority is just an entirely indifferent universe, set in the bright physical nature of Algiers, where the body and its senses become the only undeniable reality left.
And this brings us to the ultimate divergence in how to live without unquestionable authority. This is really the philosophical heart of this entire explainer. Dostoevsky's answer is that meaning absolutely does exist, but modern man just has to rediscover it. Suffering can actually be transformative. It can lead you back to compassion and faith. Camus' answer, on the other hand, is a total metaphysical rebellion. He argues there is no ultimate meaning at all, no cosmic promise that our pain leads anywhere. But, and this is absolutely crucial, Camus doesn't think life is worthless. He believes we can live fully anyway through complete lucidity and freedom.
So why do these specific books still matter to us right now in our daily lives? Let's check out Section 6, A Psychological Map of Modernity, Why This Matters Today.
The source text makes this brilliant argument that these works actually form a perfect psychological map of our 21st century problems. I mean, Dostoevsky speaks directly to our modern struggles with ideological extremism, the rationalization of evil, and rampant narcissism, this growing belief that we are somehow above the rules. Kafka? Well, he's practically the architect of our daily frustrations with faceless corporate bureaucracy, government mass surveillance, and the deep, frustrating alienation of administrative power. And Camus speaks directly to our secularism, our existential anxiety, and that profound sense of loneliness we feel when searching for meaning in a completely indifferent world. Above all, these authors are warning us that rational explanation alone is never going to be enough to fully map out the human psyche.
So how do we survive this? Well, Camus ultimately argues that we can survive the death of meaning by becoming what he calls the absurd hero. Drawing on the myth of Sisyphus, the guy condemned by the gods to roll a massive boulder up a hill for all eternity, Camus shows us that the important thing isn't actually victory, it's consciousness. The absurd hero looks at reality exactly as it is and accepts it, instead of desperately trying to invent some metaphysical explanation to make themselves feel better. They know the universe is never going to provide a final answer, yet they choose to live with full consciousness, and they revolt anyway.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought straight from Camus's world. We've seen how guilt evolved from a literal sin against God to a terrifying bureaucratic trap, and finally to a punishment for simply not pretending to care. So ask yourself this. If society still demands that we perform all these shared illusions just to fit in, what is the true cost of being simply who you are? If you refuse to participate in society's manufactured meanings, are you truly free, or are you simply the next stranger on trial?
Love the masterpiece? Subscribe for more.